Good evening. We're going to start right on time. I'm Nancy Beck from the Adult School Board, and I'd like to welcome you to the third lecture in our series on politics and religion. When we organized this series, who would have guessed that March 4th would be an important election day? Not us and not Professor Harris Lacewell. But the Adult School has only the best, so right after her lecture here at 9:15, a car will arrive to whisk our speaker off to New York to appear on national television to comment on whatever has happened, she doesn't know yet, in Ohio and Texas. So we're going to have to be sure that the question period ends in time for her to dash out the door. When we do finish, let's let her get up the stairs and out the door before the rest of us leave, and then we can all rush right home and watch her on television. That said, let me turn to the subject at hand. We're delighted tonight to welcome Melissa Harris Lacewell, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton. Professor Harris Lacewell's undergraduate work was at Wake Forest, and her PhD is from Duke. She's in the interesting position of having received an honorary doctorate from Meadville Lombard Theological School, while she's also a student at Union Theological Seminary. Her book, Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought, published by Princeton University Press in 2004, has won several awards, including the 2005 Best Book Award from the Race and Ethnic Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Her academic interests include the study of African American political thought, black religious ideas and practices, and social and clinical psychology. She really is just made for this series, isn't she? We're looking forward tonight to hearing from her about righteous politics, the role of the African American church in contemporary politics.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here on a night that indeed no one would have expected, I think, even 2 months ago, to be quite such an important election night. So much of what I will be talking about now has new resonance and maybe different resonance, given that religion and race and politics are intersecting in all of these unique and historic ways in our current presidential election. So what I want to talk about tonight is a set of ideas around religion that emerge in our understandings of the African American church as a unique set of religious experiences and religious commitments within the context of the United States. And this quote by Lincoln and Mamiya, a standard sort of way of starting conversations about the black church, asserts that the core values of black culture, freedom, justice, equality, African heritage, racial parity, at all levels of human intercourse are raised to the ultimate levels and legitimated in the sacred cosmos, given birth and nurtured in the womb of the black church. Now, there are some both accurate and distressing elements of calling the black church a womb. On the one hand, accurate in that the great deal of the labor done in the church is in fact done by African American women. Distressing in the ways in which it also turns the church into a woman, but that's a whole different set of questions that we could talk about. But what I do want to suggest here is that as I talk about the African American church within politics, one of the key things to remember from Lincoln and Mamiya's statement here is that the church is never just about the church. It's also about all the ways in which it gives birth to what we think of as the particular experiences of African American culture. That the African American church takes on a role as educator, socializer, as well as religious institution within African American communities. And so that's part of what makes its relationship vis-a-vis politics quite unique. All right, so some questions for us to consider tonight that I want to walk us through. One, is the Black church still important to political action? And we may even ask, was it ever important to political action? And I have the Black church here in quotes because it is not, in fact, just one building that we all go to on Sunday. There are multiple Black churches and Black religious experiences. And in fact, as we sort of try to talk together as a group tonight about it, hopefully I will pull apart some of the myth of a singular Black church. Can the Republican Party use faith to attract Black voters? It's not even clear to me in 2008 whether or not they want to try, but it certainly was true that there's about a decade of work in the Republican Party to use the work of faith communities and faith claims to attract a greater proportion of African American voters, or I want to claim to at least demobilize African American voters to keep them from turning out to vote for Democrats, even if they don't show up to vote for Republicans. And do African Americans still have faith in politics? Is politics still a source of meaningful attempts to end racial inequality in the U.S., or have Black Americans largely given up on this? Now, I have this photograph here, which depicts Barack Obama with a group of Black religious leaders. And it may seem funny on a day like today when the African American voting bloc is going to make such a big difference one way or another in these key states to ask whether or not African Americans still have faith in politics. But I want to suggest that even in the face of the Obama phenomenon, this is still an open political question. And finally, does Obama fit? Does Obama and sort of the Obama phenomenon fit into the things that we're going to talk about in terms of the historic and contemporary ways in which the African American church operates in American politics? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to offer us some background in order to help us get to these questions. I want to think about the Black church as a political resource, talk a little bit about African American religiosity, talk specifically about the content of Black religious ideas, or one particular set of Black religious ideas and its contemporary significance, and then the political possibilities of the church. There's going to be a lot of kind of religion talk here. Remember, I am in part a seminarian, so I'm actually going to do a little bit of political Christology for you. Hopefully, it will be fun. Okay. So one way to think about the Black church, and the way that I think most sociologists, anthropologists, and political scientists have generally thought about the Black church, is to think about the Black church as a structure. There's a little ditty I grew up with as a kid in Virginia that goes, here's the church, here's the steeple, look inside, here's the people, right? You guys remember that one? So in many ways, that's sort of how sociologists think about the church. The church is a place, a structure, right? It's the place with the people in it, and people go to it. And when they go to it, they pick up certain things there, right? In other words, the church actually operates to provide resources for the people who attend in the physical space, particularly organizational resources. So the claim here is pretty simple. If you look at the history of African American economic, social, and racial inequality, you have to ask, where would the vast majority of African Americans develop the skills necessary to be citizen actors? Right? I mean, African Americans are shut out largely from voting and sort of traditional political practice and leadership until the mid-1960s, except for a brief moment of Reconstruction. How is it that folks who are sharecroppers, domestic workers, laborers, day laborers, nannies and housekeepers, seamstresses, laundresses, how in the world would they learn political skills? Well, one of the key places where African Americans learned political skills was in the church. It's actually a place where you would go and you would learn to do things like make a speech in front of people. It's a place where you would go and you would learn to do things like call a meeting and use Robert's Rules of Order. A place where you would learn about hierarchy, right? Deacons and deaconesses, usher boards, and preachers, right? If you know anything about the Southern Baptist Church, of which much of the African American religious tradition grows out of, it is a very political space in the sense that deacon boards, right, govern collectively, often telling the preacher or the pastor what he can, mostly he can or cannot do, right? The question of whether or not women should be included, right, in the pulpit is as much a political question, right, as whether or not they should get to run for office. So many of the sort of central political questions, activities, skills, right, using a phone tree, protesting something, anything that you might imagine, these are skills that were picked up and used and developed by African Americans in the context of going to church, right, becoming active church members, resources that can then get deployed into the political world, right? So you learn them in a religious context, but they can be deployed. It's also a place where once African Americans do get the right to vote, particularly in the U.S. South, if you want to get the black vote, one of the things you do as a candidate is you show up to church on Sunday morning, right? It's a contacting opportunity. It's a mobilization opportunity. Black churches do things like provide voter registration drives, right? Drive people to the polls. All of these kind of very basic organizational resources. But in addition to that, the church also provided a set of psychological resources that were necessary for communities to be active participants and citizens, right? Part of being a citizen is not only knowing how to use a phone tree, right? Although I got to tell you these days, if anybody's working on any of the campaigns, you know that phone banking is a central political strategy, right? It's a key part of the job. But it's not just, right, being able to do it technically. It's also a sense of internal efficacy. Now again, think about what it means to come out of hundreds of years of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow, and somehow to have a sense that if you participate, you'll actually affect your government. Like, why would you think that if there's no empirical evidence for hundreds of years, right, suggesting that that would be true? Well, one of the resources that the Black church gives is a set of psychological resources. It's a place where people who are called by their first name on their jobs, right, in jobs that have very low status, they are not called by their first names in church. They're called Mr. and Mrs., sister and brother. They have roles of leadership. They wear fine clothes and hats and jewelry, right? People who often don't have an opportunity to dress up for work. And I talk often about African American preachers when people say, well, why does so much of the black leadership come out of, African American preachers? And I say, well, if you were a smart black guy and you wanted a job where you didn't have to work for white folks, what job could that possibly be, right? So for much of American history, the one job where your paycheck was paid by the contributions, or rather the taxes, right, of African Americans, is being a preacher. It makes sense, right, that that's where indigenous leadership would emerge. So the psychological resources, internal efficacy, the sense of respect, the sense of position and authority, and by the way, the sense that God loves you, you are a child of God, and you deserve to have better things, right? All of those things emerging in the Black church. So in this way, the church is really a structure that brings actors into contact with one another and with resources. But in a certain way, it's also, except for the position that God loves you, beyond that, the church could be the church, or it could be, I don't know, barbershops. It could be schools. It could be, funeral homes, whatever, right? Pick your Black institution that maybe could have acted in that way. Maybe it was just an accident of history. What is it about the church, i.e. the religion part, that matters? So I want to make a claim that as we think about Black religion and politics, all of this question of organizations, structures, a place where actors come into contact with each other is important, right? Don't want to wipe out, say, 55 years of sociological research on this, but I also want to say that we have underestimated the importance of religious ideas, and that many of those religious ideas actually exist and are propagated far beyond the physical space of the church. And that especially as we move into a new era of sort of new information technology, you don't ever have to go to church to get religious ideas, right? You can turn on the television, you can buy the books, you can listen to the webcasts, you can download it onto your iPod, right? There's lots of places where these religious ideas can be propagated without actually having to attend, right, Sunday services. Okay, so let's think about this. On the one hand, it is still important in this role, right? It's still an organizational force. Candidates still need Black churches to provide easy access points to potential voters It is still a powerful mobilizer of bodies in action, right? Churches actually get people out there. But it is undoubtedly limited in the advice that it can give on candidates. And I don't just mean this as a matter of federal taxation law, that it is limited on the advice that it can give on candidates. It is also limited on the advice it can give on candidates by the people in the pews themselves, right? That on the one hand, it does provide all of these organizational resources, but African Americans do not blindly follow their pastors if their pastor tells them to go out and vote for candidate X. Just doesn't work that way among African Americans any more than it does among other religious populations. But there are ideas that I think are not talked about as specifically not talked about as specifically political in nature, that are more fundamentally religious, but that have very important implications for religion. Okay, so a couple of things. Remember, African Americans are still the most religious Americans. They conceivably will be eclipsed by Protestant Latinos, but at this moment, African Americans continue to be the group most likely to report that they pray most frequently, most likely to report the greatest days of attendance during the week at church, most likely to report that religion is important in guiding the issues and areas of their life beyond their religious life, and most likely to report believing that the Bible is the literal word of God. Now, I could go on and on about the fact that when black folks say that, they mean something quite different than other folks, like how you might take any given internally contradictory text to be literal depends on what things you emphasize, right? And there is no question that the Bible is an internally contradictory text, so that if you understand it to be literal, you are clearly reading some parts of it and not others, right? So, but they are the most religious Americans on all of these sociological measures. It's also true that at the center of the traditional African American church experience is what we would call the prophetic social gospel, right? So again, this goes to saying, well, when they say it's a literal word of God, what parts of it are they taking literally? I sort of have a whole argument that at the core of black religious identity is actually an attachment to two big things. An attachment to what we would think of as the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, particularly the stories of the prophets, right? Sort of two big stories that are of concern in African American churches. One is, of course, the Exodus story, where God leads the people, the slaves, out of bondage, right, under the hand of Moses. That story is central in African American religious experiences. It is really the story of enslaved religion, the story that enslaved peoples hear and they go, oh, I can like that God. That sounds good to me. Let my people go. All right. My kind of God, right? So the Exodus story, right, is one central story, but then also all of the other prophets who yell at the state, right? Everybody who makes these claims that the state has a responsibility towards the least of these. You hear the prophets often preached in black churches. And then, of course, Christology, or sort of the particular narrative of Jesus Christ. But I'm going to come to that in just a second. Although there's this prophetic social gospel that on the one hand is fundamentally focused on the questions of religious responsibility. In other words, the idea that to be Christian and to be a Christian nation, to understand oneself as a kind of messianic nation, is to have a responsibility towards the least of these. But at the same time, that coexists with a very conservative private morality. That part of being sort of the most religious Americans is there's also, intense homophobia, serious issues about heterosexual, patriarchal, male family, nuclear family structures as sort of the salvation or solution to racial inequality problems. I heard Barack do this the other day. I wanted to go down to Texas and kick him. He said, and I generally love Barack, but I wanted to kick him on this one because he says, oh, you gotta feed your kids in the morning and not give them Bojangles for breakfast, and then you have to read their homework at night. And I mean, it's just like this whole rant of conservative private morality. And the African Americans in Beaufort, Texas were like, wow! Speak the truth, Barack! And I was like, wow, that's troubling. We actually ended this school system providing decent meals to the children. And, sometimes people are working, Barack. When was the last time you helped with homework? Not recently. Why? Because someone was there to do it for you. Okay, so, all right. But there is this kind of conservative private morality that goes right along with this prophetic social gospel. And there's also this big question of whether or not Christianity encourages or discourages political action among African Americans. In other words, is it an opiate or is the church fundamentally political? So let me walk through that real quickly. Opiate theories, and there's a whole series of them, basically say something like this. The black church provides either an assimilation route into general American life that is isolating because it's generally a very segregated racial experience, or it is compensatory. And compensatory basically says, hey, it's hard to be black in America. On any given day, you are coping with all of the ways in which white supremacy, racism, and racial inequality are affecting you. So when you go to church on Sunday, part of the kinetic, physical, emotional, right, experience of black spiritual worship is about letting off the steam of inequality. And that while that's good, it also simply kind of bears people up to go out and face it again on Monday. And that, good job, we should bear people up, but then in doing so, we also might fail to be encouraging them to actually take on those structures, right? So there's a whole set of theorists who have an argument that the church fundamentally operates as a kind of opiate. On the other hand, there's a set of theorists who say, no. Historically, the black church is actually a space for political involvement, that it provides these organizational and psychological resources, and that when we look at everything from people who were enslaved, who used the church as a way, the kind of black Jeremiah, the black prophetic tradition, as a way to make arguments against slavery, all the way to the contemporary civil rights movement, all the way to Jesse Jackson's 84 and 88 presidential bids. The black church is a site of politics, right? So there are these two kind of arguments. Is it fundamentally otherworldly, telling black folks, things are rough in this world, but don't worry. Suffering is redemptive, and you will, achieve a prize in heaven? Or does it say to black folks, actually get engaged here? Now, what I want to suggest is let's put aside for a moment the opiate theories. Let's just for a second say there seems to be sufficient evidence that at least some portion of black churches are fundamentally concerned with this worldly activities and issues, right? That yes, there may be churches only focused on the afterlife, but let's look at this worldly theories. Now, what I want to claim is that ideas are a church resource. The religion is really in the advice-giving business. And that within the African American church, advice is often wrapped up in the figure of Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Christ. Okay, so there are some ways in which the particular figure of Jesus gets deployed as a set of religious ideas, all on this worldly side of the notions of the black church, right? So all sort of focused on how African Americans can engage in this side. But it's not as though there's just one Jesus, right? There are these multiple Jesuses that you might meet on any given Sunday in any given black church. And I'm particularly interested in liberation theology and prosperity gospel. I want to ask a question here about the stories about Jesus that are told by each of these approaches and the political implications of those stories. So basically I want to say, or ask, how do these theological traditions, black liberation theology on one hand and the prosperity gospel on the other, understand and conceptualize Christ? Let me just super quickly give you the fastest definition of liberation theology and prosperity gospel that you might ever encounter. Liberation theology is interestingly in the news these days. I mean, who would have thunk it? But liberation theology is in the news these days because Barack Obama is a member of Trinity United Church of Christ under the pastorship of Jeremiah Wright, who is a very old-fashioned liberation theologian preacher. And there aren't very many of them, but he is one of them. And liberation theology really emerged as an academic discipline in the 1960s, right, out of Garrett Theological Seminary, out of James Cone, as a response specifically to the Black Power movement, which was encouraging African Americans to move away from Christianity and towards the Nation of Islam. And the claim went something like this: hey, you cannot be a serious down revolutionary brother trying to make a difference for the community and bowing down to a white Jesus every day. If you are serious about it, black liberation brother, you are going to have to come over to the nation because Christianity is the slave master's religion. Now, that's not really a bad argument. There are some good elements to that argument. The problem is black folks really like Jesus. they've been down with Christianity a really long time. So James Cone and others said, man, there must be some way to redeem the experience of Christianity for African Americans. Is it really that we have to leave? We've got to go to the nation? There must be some other alternative. So black liberation theology suggests, how about we reread the Christian text? How about we think differently about the story of who is Jesus? And what if we, maybe as we read it, we reimagine the concept of a black Christ? So I'm going to come to that in 1 second. Okay, but that's sort of black liberation theology. Prosperity gospel is a newer theological tradition, and it is one that is not at all exclusive to black experience. In fact, it is a broad, non-denominational, evangelical worldview, one that is international in focus, and it goes something like this. If you want to know whether or not God loves you, look around at your life right now. Are you out of debt? Do you have a cute spouse? Is your house paid off? Are your bills paid up? Is your health good? Are your children doing well? Is everybody out of jail? Are things going well? That looks like you are down with God, and God is dead. Now, are you sick? Are you broke? You ain't got no man? Maybe you are not doing the right things by God. You need to kind of get yourself into a different place with God, right? So we know that God loves us, right? And we know that we are in right relationship with God by very clear empirical evidence all around us. Okay, so the prosperity gospel in this sense suggests that Christ is an investment strategy. I like to say Jesus is a mutual fund. If you give Jesus 10%, right, he will press it down, shake it up, and send it back to you, right, overflowing, right? Jesus is, in this conception, a kind of personal life coach, right? In fact, when you read the prosperity gospel stuff, I mean, really, the thing is, like, you can't argue with some of it. You turn the TV off. I mean, Barack was totally performing this the other night, right? Turn the TV off. Well, that seems good. You probably should. Turn the TV off, right? But this idea that part of what Jesus does is provide you with really good rules for living, and you kind of exercise your religious muscle, right? I also say that in this particular framing, Jesus is almost like a magical talisman. He's like a rabbit's foot, right? And if you rub him the right way and shake him 4 times on Wednesday and 3 times on Saturday, then you can and do the right incantations, right? There's particular sort of prayers that you do, extend my territory. You know, there's these sort of things that you do that are meant to activate God, right? Sort of like, boom. Right, okay, so there is no particular teaching on race. In other words, in this strategy, God isn't particularly interested in if you're black or white or male or female or rich or poor. He's more interested in your kind of personal issues. And more than anything, and this is the key, the relationship between God and the believer, and particularly between Jesus and the believer, is individual, right? It is about you, maybe your household, right? Maybe it extends as broadly as your household, but really it's about you and God. In fact, you'll hear him say, this is between me and God. That's why God can sometimes do things like tell you, you should be president and invade Iraq, right? Okay, the relationship is individual, okay? Now, then there's this other Christ, right? And within the context of liberation theology, Christ is black. Now let me be clear. There are sort of 2 strands of liberation theology. One says Jesus is black. Okay, now remember there's a difference between Jesus and Christ. Let me just do a quick Christology for you here. Jesus of Nazareth is the actual historical dude walking around on the earth. Okay? Christ is what happens after this very extraordinary death and the very extraordinary thing that happens after death, right? So Christ is something that occurs as this kind of transfiguration of the historical person. There is a set of theories within within liberation theology that says Jesus is black. That the historical guy walking around, they do this tracing of Mary to African lineage, and that is less at the core, right, of what liberation theology is. Liberation theology is more interested with the ontological blackness of Christ. In other words, to say, what is it that happens in that moment of the death and resurrection is that Christ takes on a preferential option for the least of these. God takes on a preferential option for the poor, the dispossessed, and those likely to be lynched or crucified, right? That in the context of 20th century America, Christ is black. Whether or not historical Jesus of Nazareth was or not is sort of irrelevant. The point is that who Christ is, fundamentally, is black in his ontological conception of relationship to human beings. And that in this sense, Christ's essential character is the liberator. This is a complete rereading of the Nicene Creed. So anyone who knows, Council of Nicaea, that the story goes, right? Jesus is born of the Virgin Mary, suffers under Pontius Pilate, is crucified, dead, and buried, rises again on the third day, right? Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, dead, and buried, rose again on the third day. You may notice that what's missing there between the extraordinary birth story and the exceptional death story is the whole life of Christ. In other words, Nicaea tells us that what makes Jesus of Nazareth, the human being walking around, into the Christ is that he had a pretty unusual birth and a pretty unusual death. What liberation theology says is, okay, maybe, but what makes Jesus the Christ is the extraordinary life that he led in between. So it says Nicaea is in fact actually ignoring the whole thing that makes Jesus the Christ. That what makes Jesus the Christ is the washing of the feet of his servants, right? That it's the teachings of sitting at the table with those who are despised, with drawing in the tax collectors as well as everyone else, right? That it is the life of Christ that is the relevant issue. So in this, right, quite differently than in prosperity theology, Christ's relationship to black people is both special and collective. There's a preferential option for those who are the least of these, and the relationship is to the collective, to the group. It is much more like, right, remember I told you there's this sort of prophetic social gospel tradition in which, right, God, Yahweh, has a relationship to his people, Israel, right? So Israel is often talked about as a single person, but it is a collective relationship. And so what God expects is that the collective will behave in particular ways. And that is very, very different than the saying, it is just between me and God, right? In this conception, it is between us and God. So in this sense, political involvement actually becomes a religious responsibility. That part of what it means to be Christian is to be like Christ. And since being like Christ is not about having an exceptional birth and death, but is instead about this particular set of life experiences, right, then you are called to a different kind of relationship. So what I do here is I just say, okay, if we were just to kind of take this out theoretically, this kind of black Messiah might act as a psychological resource that can be accessed for political action, and that black theology may mandate a collective approach to politics, that the prosperity gospel is more pervasively individualistic and might promote a more individualized dispositional understanding of inequality. Okay. I want to move quickly through the numbers here, but I just want you to see that what I do is look at some data just to kind of see what this might look like if we actually played it out in public opinion. This is the 94 National Black Politics Study of 1,206 African Americans. We have this one measure here which asks, when you think about Christ, do you imagine him as being black or white? About a quarter of African Americans, or actually just over a fifth, say, I see him as being black. About another quarter say, I see him as being white. The rest say, he's nothing, which is very odd because although God may be nothing, Jesus certainly was something, although maybe Christ, but I just don't think people are doing Christology quite that intensely, but only about a quarter saying they imagine him as black. Then I ask there's another question that's asked, is it true that the humiliation and oppression experienced by black people is a sign that God is absent? This is what I call an instrumental understanding of God. If when you're suffering, God's not there, right, and when things are going well, God is there, this is just sort of a proxy, not a very good one, but just kind of a proxy for this sort of instrumental prosperity gospel understanding. Just real quickly, you might want to look here and see men are much more likely to think of Christ as black. Older people are somewhat more likely, but more than anything, it is urban Baptists who don't go to church very often, who think of Christ as black. Now, part of what I found important about sort of the very large coefficient of people who don't go to church very often is that if you actually attend church, you pretty quickly start seeing a lot of images of usually a non-black Christ, right? Usually a white Christ. So it's more people who actually don't attend as frequently. Okay, and education and income are negatively related to the belief that God is absent. In other words, prosperity gospel being more likely to occur among the working class and the less educated than among the wealthy and more educated. Just quickly, consequences for political activism. I just want to look at whether or not this liberation theology mandates this. So I just look at the vote. Did you vote in the last presidential election? Have you contacted a public official? Have you attended a protest meeting? Have you taken part in a neighborhood march? And have you signed a petition in support of or against something? The way to think about this measure is if you have done all of these in the past year, you'd get a 1. If you did none of them, you'd get a 0. If you did some portion of them right, you'd get a proportion in between. And this is really way too much for you to see. But the main thing I want you to see is simply that very top variable there, right there, 0.06. It just is to demonstrate, I mean, the biggest one to see is that if you do political action in the church, 0.45, you're also very likely to do political action outside the church. That goes to the organizational resources argument that I was making earlier. But even once we've accounted for the learning, the organizational learning that happens in church, there is still an independent effect for the belief in a black Christ, right? So that in fact, if you believe that Jesus is black, you are in fact more likely to engage in all these political activities that I just asked about. Okay, so in 2008, what would Jesus do? One might suggest that Jesus would not vote at all, right? I mean, sort of a bizarre kind of question. But let's see, yes, that. I mean, one thing to ask is whether or not Obama is a new or an old style black religious politician. I mean, clearly a lot of who Barack is seems very, very new, but then there are also all these things that are resonances of something quite old. So this might be something I'd actually like to leave for us to possibly have in conversation, but I think it's worth asking, does he represent organizationally the things that I've talked about? Is he using African American churches as an organizational space for building his candidacy in the way that many, not only African American, but Democrats in general, have made use of the African American church? Is he, right, someone who attends a liberation theology church, is he a liberation theologian in his actions? Is he presenting and representing someone who has a belief in the black Christ and all of the kind of prophetic social gospel tradition that goes along with that? Or, right, is he fundamentally a prosperity theology guy, right? Is he more individualized in his conceptions of God and of religion? Will Trinity United Church of Christ help or hurt his presidential bid? There is no question that being a member of Trinity United Church of Christ was extremely helpful in Barack Obama becoming a state senator and becoming the U.S. Senator from Illinois. But will this church now become a liability, right? Again and again, the questions of Jeremiah Wright and Louis Farrakhan have been emerging in this particular election. And so religion now is getting complex for Barack Obama. And is the black church still relevant at all? Right? I mean, clearly in this particular election, there is an increasing emphasis on racial consciousness, one that had gone away in some ways, that had moved to the side as increasingly African Americans were becoming less attached to the Democratic Party, not quite attached to the Republican Party yet, but less attached to the Democratic Party. But now racial consciousness is becoming a central reason given for why black people should behave or act or vote in particular ways. Now, black churches are more socially active than white congregations overall, although, right, Southern evangelical congregations behave the way that traditionally black churches have. Now, 92% of black clergy nationwide advocate church involvement in social and political activities. This is far more than the clergy in traditional white organizations, particularly mainstream or mainline Protestantism, which sees more importantly a kind of wall or separation between church and state. And Sunday morning campaigning remains central, right, for every level, not only the presidency, right, but for everything that I like to call dog catcher to Senate, right? The black church is still a place for attending and trying to meet the needs. Now, also, we might again ask, can the GOP attract black Christians? The answer is, I think, maybe. There is a distinct history that means that the political right does not own God in black politics, right? The notion of religious rhetoric is not fundamentally a right issue. In many ways, it's a left issue. But morality wedge issues are possible, but much more difficult post-Katrina. So many of them, morality wedge issues, for example, gay marriage, that had emerged as possibilities for GOP attraction of black vote, or at least the demobilization of the black vote for Democrats. After 2005, post-Katrina, becomes very, very difficult for the GOP to make these kinds of arguments. That said, I do think that prosperity gospel evangelism can demobilize. I do think that to the extent that prosperity gospel is a fast-growing religious worldview among African Americans, the more that it suggests that your problems, solutions, lie and rest fundamentally with your individual dispositional behavior, instead of the collective action of either the community or of the government, the less likely African Americans are going to be to fundamentally see government action and political action as the means for addressing racial inequality. So this goes back to that question I asked before. Do black folks still have faith in politics? Now, clearly, there is a huge mobilization effort around a particular candidate at this moment. But whether or not that translates into sort of a continuing idea or notion or connection to either the Democratic Party or to the state in general, I think still is to be seen. And finally, a charismatic candidate on the GOP side might be possible, right? Might possibly be able to bring some population of black voters, but not in 2008, right? It's not happening in this particular presidential election year. Thank you. I want to give you guys an opportunity to ask questions about anything I've presented or about the elections or anything that you'd like to talk about around this. Yes, right.
One of the things that you started with, but I don't think really got to, was this idea of the left
Sure.
and origins and history and
Yeah.
Fundamentally, what does that really mean?
Right. Yeah, right. I suppose I only got to it in the sense of suggesting there are multiple streams of thought, right? Certainly, the black church traditionally has meant these sort of traditional black congregations, the Southern Baptists, the AMEs, right, this sort of population of African American church, many of whom are simply offshoots of established white mainline churches, and because of segregated religious practices, they weren't able to worship together, or they made choices not to worship together, and so they founded their own institutions and organizations. And there are some differences, right, among those main lines, some that are important both in terms of kind of high church, low church, in terms of ordination of women, all of those kinds of things. But more fundamentally, I think the distinction that is relevant for kind of contemporary black religious life is the distinction between all of those mainline or traditional black churches kind of grouped together and the new movement of non-denominational, Protestant, largely evangelical churches, many of whom are associated with prosperity gospel, but not all of them. And many of those churches being much more interracial in their worship services. So I would identify them only as black in the sense that they still have African American leadership, right? So black clergy, and they share many of the texts and traditions of the African American mainline religious practices. But there is this big, important divide within black Protestantism between kind of the traditional group of churches, which are all very strong hierarchy churches, and the kind of emerging mega church. There's one other really important group, and those are the storefront small Pentecostals, which are not part of either one of those traditions, right, but have been particularly critically important in urban areas, both urban areas inside and outside the South. So small storefront churches that have very, very low church, right, very low hierarchy, not necessarily connected to any national organization of one kind or another, very, very Bible-based or Bible-believing, right, fundamentally about interpretations of the text rather than about sort of tradition and old, older ways of the clergy interpreting it, right? They're more like sort of your own personal revealed understanding of the text. And interestingly, on the one hand, although they tend to have very strict gender practices in certain ways. You know, women are meant to wear skirts, often cover their heads, that kind of thing. They also have traditionally been a place where women are more likely to be able to preach. So you see women rising to the capacity of the pulpit in many of these churches in ways that they haven't, for example, in Baptist churches. Here?
I want to know what you think about the relationship between, for the Black community, between the Clintons on the one hand, and Barack Obama on the other, because it seems that, at least in the beginning, the more traditional top political base was siding with the Clinton side
Yeah.
of things. And it's not clear to me, it's clear that a lot of people have changed, but I'm not clear exactly about the old line.
Sure. I mean, this goes, I think, to my point about there's still a limitation on just what they can tell you to do in terms of who to vote for. So they get you all mobilized to vote, but they can't exactly tell you who to vote for. So there's lots of things going on in that relationship. And I probably, I'm trying to think of sort of the easiest ways to talk about it. One, African Americans are now forgetting how much they did like Bill Clinton in many of the same ways that African Americans will lie. They'll be like, oh, we never liked Clarence Thomas, when in fact 55% of African Americans supported the confirmation of Clarence Thomas at the time that he was confirmed. But, you know, black folks also now know that OJ did it, but we didn't. Right. Okay, so we're a dynamic community, you know, our opinions change. But my argument has been that the support of Bill Clinton during Clinton's era had everything to do with Bill Clinton coming under attack by the right. That the more that the right attacked, the more that African Americans closed ranks around him. This is a very traditional and expected behavior on the part of African Americans, both in political life as well as public life generally. So we see it happen every time a public figure who is a male public figure who is in some way identified with African American communities, whether it's R. Kelly or O.J. Simpson or Bill Clinton, when they get attacked by people who are perceived as enemies of the black community will get behind you. We love an underdog, and we particularly love an underdog who seems to be being attacked by our enemies. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Bill Clinton was able to do a variety of pretty nasty things in terms of policy to African American communities, including the growth of the prison industrial complex, signing the Welfare Reform Act, walking away from Lonnie Guinier, treating Jocelyn Elders badly, you know, I mean, all kinds of things that he did that were symbolically, and as well as in terms of content policy, destructive to African American political interests. But as long as he was under attack, African Americans were largely supportive. Plus, Bill Clinton, being from Arkansas, actually does have, even better than Barack, as a pure sort of natural, like, read. He does Southern culture. Black culture is Southern culture, and he does it, I mean, he can sing every single word of Lift Every Voice and Sing without reading it. He knows it by heart. I mean, he just does. It's true, and he's very good at it. So that's part of what prompted Toni Morrison to call him the first black president, right? She's talking about his ease with black cultural tropes. Okay, except that, then they started running against an actual black guy. And Hillary Clinton is no Bill Clinton in terms of ease with cultural tropes. So when she got down to Selma and started faking a Southern accent, it was a problem, right? So there's ways in which, on the one hand, there was this big support for Bill, but then particularly as we get to South Carolina, right, African Americans get behind the actual black guy instead of, I think it had been a real fight, by the way, between Bill and Barack. I think those two, I think that would have been up for grabs. But Hillary's not Bill. So that's part of it, on just sort of what's going on with ordinary folks, right? And then, as much as there had been a kind of reservation around, is Barack black enough? Part of the reason the question was whether or not Barack was black enough because he wasn't under attack. Once he got attacked, once again, black people were like, whoa! I see. You are like us. You are being attacked, right? And then when Bill Clinton became the attacker, right, then he goes over to the other side. So that's part of it. But then you say, but why is Stephanie Tubb Jones like having a moment? And why is Sheila Jackson Lee? And I'm like, why are all of them still fundamentally standing behind Hillary? And I think there's lots of answers to that question. One has to do with, you know, the very basic bread and butter politics of loyalty that has everything to do with resources, and has everything to do with very old attachments to the Clinton political machine, which has resources. And part of it had to do with simply placing your bets too early. And everybody placed it. I mean, let me be clear. Not even, in fact, especially not Barack's campaign strategist had any idea this was going to happen. Everybody's really, like, David Axelrod surely thought that Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic nominee. 100%. 100%. I mean, if you go back, look at David Axelrod. I will do this all night. David Axelrod, who is the chief strategist for Barack Obama, is an old-fashioned Chicago political thug. That's who this guy is, right? He is. He's a thug. Sometimes you need a thug, but that's who Axelrod is. He's good at his job. He's hired him, those things. He's also has had a theory for a decade. And his theory has been the way that Republicans win is Republicans win by running candidates light on policy, heavy on character. The Republicans whoop Democrats, because Democrats come out and go, I have a flow chart. Here's how I will solve your problems. And Republicans come out and go, hey, want to have a beer? Come on, let's go have a beer. And then when Democrats run the let's have a beer guy, Bill Clinton, right, we do really well. So his theory was, I wonder if we could run, in a contemporary era, a Democrat relatively light on policy and relatively heavy on character. He is the guy who gave us, in John Edwards' campaign in 2004, son of a mill worker. That's David Axelrod, right? He framed for you. Now you all know who John Edwards is. Who is he? He's the son of a mill worker. Tell me right, he's the son of a mill worker. And then later, husband of Elizabeth Edwards, right? That's who he is, fundamentally. That's all framed up by Axelrod. So Axelrod figures, well, Hillary Clinton's going to be the nominee. She's a pretty good nominee. Probably going to win. Things are kind of falling apart in New Orleans for the Republicans. So looks like we're going to win. Let's try this out with some unknown black guy who is a state senator 15 minutes ago in the state of Illinois. Let's see if we can't turn him into somebody. Create a little character. Now, the amazing thing is that Barack did to David Axelrod what he does to every single person who ever encounters him, which is he transcends their expectations of him. So Axelrod, up until like 15 minutes ago, you could see it on his face. Every Iowa, New Hampshire, he's looking like, I can't believe this is working. I am shocked. The hope thing, people really wanted the hope thing. Who knew? Now, let me be clear. I don't mean that Barack is actually light on policy, right? It would be, for example, a mistake to think that George Bush was actually light on policy. He wasn't light on policy at all. He's one of the most heavy-handed policy presidents we've ever had. Next to FDR, I think he's actually the most heavy-handed policy president, internationally and domestically, any president we've ever had next to FDR, contemporary president, right? So he campaigned light on policy, but he was quite clearly had a very strong policy agenda. I think the same thing is true of Barack Obama. He has a very strong policy agenda, but that's not really your business, right? Your fundamental approach to him is strong character, light on policy, and the amazing thing is Axelrod, who I don't like, is right. And it has been incredibly powerful, right? And in fact, Hillary Clinton is still giving, don't you believe everything she says? I believe everything she says about her policy. I will do A, B, and I'm like, I believe she probably will, and I do not care. I'm like, yeah, she probably will. This is probably true, but who cares? I don't know what he's going to do, but won't it be fun to find out? So, and I'm not saying that it's bad or good to vote for either one of them, but it is strategic in these ways, right? It is fundamentally strategic in these ways. So part of the reason that people laid bets so early is because everybody, David Axelrod, everybody thought Hillary would be the nominee. When African Americans were laying their bets, it was very much saying, hey, we may actually have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic White House. You want to be on the inside of that, right? If you're a power broker, you want to be brokering the power. And as it starts to fall away, it'll be interesting to see what happens if she surges tonight, but so that's what it is. Ordinary people are judging on a whole different set of things. than political elites are, black and white, right? So there's not one community where the elites are leading the masses. No, there's just very different calculations going on at each level. I'll come down front for a second, yeah.
After that, entertaining.
Sorry.
Well, I'm afraid this is slightly more academic. In your talks, you have the words psychological and individual.
Mm-hmm.
Last week we had Marie Griffith.
Oh.
And so she was talking about pluralism to some extent, and she talked about prayer and hypothesized the question of who are you praying to, which one of the gods are, and what are you going to do with that issue. And so prayer, I thought about that a lot, and I feel that prayer is one of the essential events in a church.
Mm-hmm.
If they're called to prayer, they're called to worship. And what's going on in the prayer? And I would like to hear psychological thing like, the supplicant or the person giving the prayer is addressing somebody else. They're voicing something to the God or Christ or something. And they want to be heard. The important thing is to be given a hearing, be heard. And this is crucial in both the prayer and in the politics, is to be, and the people campaigning say, well, we're going to hear from America all the time. So they want to be sure that you know you will be heard.
Yeah, so I guess I would say yes and no, because that's what professors say. So I would say that in the context of a black church service, prayer is important, but less important than you might imagine, and less important than in many other denominational settings. So a couple of things. One, for example, when Catholics pray, they are praying through liturgy. Everybody knows the words, right? And it's a traditional liturgy, and when you say it, it invokes kind of a commonness, right? Our Father, Hail Mary, right? Right, saints, right. But there's common liturgical prayers available to everyone, and everyone says them together in part as a kind of collective hearing of God, of the interests of the community. And there's also, individuals who stand up in the context of the Catholic Church and ask for specific things, right? Especially on Life Sunday or Veterans Sunday or whatever. Okay. In African American churches, Protestant churches, frequently, not exclusively, the prayer is serving a very different purpose and often shows up at a very different time than you might expect. So one, the music is a big part of worship, and the collectivity and the call and response of the musical selections is as much prayer as spoken prayer, right? So sometimes spoken prayer, there may be one, but music, there may be six.
Let's go to a hymn.
Not go to hymn. Occasionally, high church, white glove, silk stocking Baptist hymns. But yeah, no, more kinetic gospel, right? Prayer in the black church is often more performative and as much about speaking to the congregation as speaking to God. So there's silences and there's opportunities for individualized prayer, but it is generally collective and is as much about a call and response between the minister and the congregation. So
the performance is for an audience.
yes.
And the audience could be God, but it could be the congregation.
But what I'm suggesting is I think often the audience is congregation rather than God. Which is not, again, I don't want to suggest here nobody cares about God in the black church. No, not at all, right? But that part of what you're doing as a minister praying in the black church is you're trying to, how you know you're on the right track is that people are not quiet. They're telling you you're on the right track. So if you're praying and you say, somebody in here needs God to heal them today. See, if it goes silent, then you have messed up. No one in here needs God to heal them. You're like, oh, hell. Somebody in here is broke and needs the Lord to say, and then you hear, whoa! Right? So, that's where we're going to go. Okay. So that, right? So that's how you know where to go, right? It's because you never get, if you got in silence, you're praying wrong. And so you're on the wrong topic. You got to move over. And so it is about being heard, but it's also kind of, it is different. But I will say, I agree that there is something powerfully important about the idea of one's votes being heard in ways that one's prayers are heard, right? Your votes being heard and answered is similar to the responsibility of your, or the sense of like divine connection when your prayers are heard and answered. This is part of why in urban radio all over the country, African Americans are calling in and saying, if the superdelegates give it to Hillary, we're exiting stage left. I mean, they're very clear. They're calling up Tom Joyner, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton. They're like, if the superdelegates, if the people vote for Barack and the superdelegates give it to Hillary, we're outie. John McCain ain't that bad. Whatever. Ralph Nader's in the race. Let's go. I mean, seriously, because it's part of this notion of being heard. If I have gone out of my way to voice myself and you can't bother to hear me, right, then I think there is something about that, but I do want to suggest that even prayer, even sort of, yeah, I mean, and it shows up in funny ways that are non-church places too, like this Tavis Smiley State of the Black Union. When people are performing the intellectual work and the political work, they're also performing something very close to the religious practices as well. Yeah, in the orange.
Two questions. The first one is, what channel are you
Oh, sorry. I'm doing Charlie Rose live at 11 p.m. Yeah, so PBS. Yeah, that was easy.
How do you see, what is your view of the impact of a serious economic downturn on this prosperity gospel view of government involvement?
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually think that part of what prosperity gospel is it is the religious attendant that you would expect to go along with a vulnerable new middle class, which is what African Americans are, right? So you are finally able to begin to close the income gap, even as the wealth gap is growing, and with the current mortgage crisis likely to grow even greater, right? So you have income gap over the past 50 years beginning to close, but the wealth gap has expanded 50 years ago. It was about 5 times median, now it's about 11. My bet is give it another 12, it'll be up to 12 or 13 after the mortgage crisis works its way out. So if you are earning $100,000, more money than any person in your family ever thought about, right? You and your husband earn $100,000. And you own a house, brand new, just built it, developer, right, in a neighborhood that has kind of dicey public schools. And your parents weren't homeowners. They weren't shut out of a GI Bill, or they were domestic workers or whatever. So they weren't homeowners. So you've got $100,000, but your $100,000 is reaching back to help support parents who were unable to build wealth, who may have been outside of the Social Security system because of the labor that they did. And it's reaching forward to cope with kind of the taxation of marginalization that occurs on your children, right? The responsibility of not putting your kid in the public school in Houston, which is available to you, even though you live in a nice, big, pretty house, right? You live in a community that doesn't have good schools, so you're reaching back and forward, right? Everything looks okay. It's more money than you ever thought you'd make, and yet you're incredibly vulnerable. And your government doesn't like you. And maybe you thought your government liked you, but then Hurricane Katrina happened, and it looks like, no, seriously, they really don't like you. So you're thinking, okay, this is right. I'm here, and the floodwaters are coming. God, right? I need help, and divine help sounds good, and I really, really don't want to hear that unearned suffering is redemptive. I mean, hell. That does not sound like an enjoyable way to spend my Sunday, right? I'm here, and the flood is coming, and my government doesn't like me. I would much rather hear that God is all-powerful, intervening in human history on a daily and minute basis, interested in making sure that I am debt-free, married, and healthy, right? And because if God has a preferential option for poor people, suffering people, and will stand by me as I mean, woo, that sounds scary. I'm sick of suffering. I'm tired of it. I know all about that. Maybe God was there, but I seem to be the one helping my parents pay the mortgage. So right? So in other words, there's no question that part of what you need is a vulnerable class, right, is a God who is all-powerful, who is intervening, who is showing up in the minutia of your life, who is interested in taking care of, right? Because if your government isn't providing health care, then you may really want a God who is, right, in a really sort of base level fundamental way. So I suspect that although it seems like economic vulnerability would decrease the prosperity gospel, because it would seem to decrease the evidentiary basis for, right, the fact is, since we're all so human and we're all messing up all the time, there's always plenty of reason for you to believe a dispositional basis that it's your own actions that are keeping you from getting the prosperity. No matter how good you are human, so you're messing up. So there's always good evidence that it's your fault that you're not getting the good stuff. No, I mean, I have to say, I think there's I don't think I can just say it'll be one or the other, but I do think there is strong reason to believe that it could lead to greater individual. It just isn't, I mean, look, Bill Cosby promises us that if we pull up our pants, name our kids Pam instead of Kenesha, and stop listening to hip hop, that it'll all work out. And that is definitely a much easier solution to the problem than actually we're going to have to fight off, right, 500 years of ingrained, racism, white supremacy, white privilege that puts, like nobody, that story, woohoo, that's tiring and exhausting and seems like it takes a lot of resources. And it, as distressing as the individual dispositional analysis might seem like it is, it's actually also quite empowering because it sounds like you can fix it, right? You and God, you and an all-powerful and interested God can fix it. So I actually think economic downturn, likely to see it even more prosperity gospel. All the way up in the back. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on whether or not we're talking about Martin King who was martyred and died, or whether it's Martin King who would have lived 40 more years. I mean, in other words, Andy Young, that's pretty scary. And if Martin King had lived, for all I know, Martin King would have been a big, scary sellout. I mean, I don't think so, but possible. I mean, Martin King could be Clarence Thomas had he lived. I don't know. He was an evolving political thinker. It's possible Martin King would have had really enough of America and would be living as an expatriate in West Africa. That certainly would happen to Du Bois, right? They just sort of had enough of the American system. So if you're asking what do I think that King circa 1968 would have thought, I mean, King circa 1968 I think would look at Barack Obama and say, this is part of the fulfillment of the dream. Right? I mean, I think there's kind of no question about that. That king standing here would have supported Barack Obama. But an actual human living being who would have lived through the Reagan era and everything else, who would he be? I don't know. I mean, Stokely Carmichael turned into something else. Bob Moses does algebra. I mean, these icons of the civil rights movement turned into other things because they were evolving people, and I assume that King too would have. But yeah, King 68, he would have loved Barack. Yeah. Okay. Oh, in the black church. Well, I mean, so in the black church, he's seen as a heretic in the sense that, I mean, again, black folks love Jesus, but I will say that Farrakhan is still an important political leader within blackness in that he called, now more than a decade ago, the Million Man March in 1995, right? He was able to bring people together for those purposes. What I think about Farrakhan, sort of myself, is that he's clearly a nasty, funky anti-Semite, right? That's true. He is that. He is also these other things which are not all bad, which is to say he's also sort of this kind of racial spokesman who says things that many ordinary African Americans are thinking but don't have a platform to say. And I don't think that one completely cancels the other, which is to say Thomas Jefferson owned his own children in intergenerational chattel slavery and wrote the Declaration of Independence. And one does, I mean, he was a funky racist. who owned his own kids, or at least owned some other people's kids, clearly. 100% did that. He also wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Louis Farrakhan ain't never said nothing that good. I mean, that's quite a sentence if you ever in your life ever get to write a sentence that good, right? So Farrakhan never did anything that good, but I might also suggest that his anti-Semitic views, as disgusting as they are, also are maybe not as bad as actual having slaves, right? So he's neither as bad nor as good as a Thomas Jefferson. So what I would just say is I suspect Farrakhan is generally irrelevant to black communities, except at individual moments when he sometimes expresses something which seems to be part of kind of a collective consciousness where people are like, oh yeah, that is just what I was thinking. Me too, right? So there's a way in which he's a kind of black bad man who says these things who's kind of free from white influence. But the nation is utterly marginalized. The Nation of Islam is an utterly marginalized institution in the black community. It no longer owns most of the holdings that it once had. Its main source of new recruits is prison. And even most new recruits who are formerly incarcerated persons are going to more traditional Islamic religions. Even the nation itself has split twice now into other more mainstream Islamic religions. So, this still shows up in black bookstores. People read Frances Cress Welsing, that kind of thing. But it's not, it's thoroughly marginalized.
Great.
Get you on your way.